Hello, everyone. My name is Tori. This is Mr. Garth. Today, I wanted to talk about breathwork. I decided that I was going to look into it and figure out what the heck it is. My first question was, why? What is the goal? Like, what is the purpose? And looking into it, most people do breathwork before meditation. So it's kind of the groundworks, the setup for meditation. The goal of it is to make you aware of your body, your surroundings, your mind, what's going on, to really come into a present space so you can meditate. So I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. One day, I was driving home from work and I had an awful day. I just had an awful day. And I think I was having a little bit of a panic attack. I felt like the world wasn't going to ever be normal again. And I was like, well, okay. Nothing was really working, calming me down, talking to the people I usually talk to. So I was like, I'm just gonna try breathwork. I'm just gonna go for it, and if it helps, it helps, and if it doesn't, whatever. Like, I'm at no loss. I sat in the bathtub, which is my dojo, my place of serenity, and I put on this guy named Dylan Werner. He's on Aloe Moves, and he has a new series called Breathwork. Yeah, I started to actually calm the fuck down. Like, it worked. I could feel my heart rate increasing and decreasing with the different holds and techniques he was using. And that sparked more curiosity. How am I able to increase my heart rate so rapidly and then decrease it and have this wave of calm kind of wash over me? Right away, I had this anxiety and this stress where you want to breathe and you want to break from holding it. And then a kind of a flip switches and you're like, cool with it. And it was almost scary to me because I'm like, okay, I feel comfortable holding my breath after feeling that panic of, okay, breathe, breathe, breathe. After a few more seconds of pushing past that, okay, take a breath, take a breath, take a breath, you hit this period where you can hold your breath and then it becomes comfortable. And the calmness washes over you. And it was bizarre to me. I've never really experienced anything like that. I decided, I'm sure I'm not alone with knowing what the heck was going on. And I was sure that probably more people than not don't even really know what it is, because I didn't. So I decided I was going to look into it. There was so much information, and there was a little bit of, I'm not really into the yoga talk. I don't relate well with it. I don't understand it very well. Science makes more sense to me, and I think there are more people like that than people who understand the yoga terms, the yogic talk. So I did some research, and I'm going to try to correlate in my own words how it relates to yoga and what actually are you doing when you're doing breath work. So to understand what pranayama is in yoga, we need to break it down a little bit, and then we'll come back and we will talk about it in scientific anatomy terms. Okay, what is pranayama? Pranayama means breath work in Sanskrit. Let's break down the word. Prana is life force. Ayama is drawing out. So together, drawing out the life force or the breath. And the goal of it in yoga is to be aware and to control your mental, your physical, your emotional state, which makes sense. Breath controls different parts of our nervous system, which we will get into. Where did this originate from? China, Tibet, India. These are all very ancient. I don't know much about it, okay? This is like overload of information. So this is just skimming. It's not even skimming the top, okay? But it is a very ancient form of yoga. The goal of yoga is to be present, to notice your thoughts, to be okay with where you're at. And the origins of yoga in life start when we're in the womb. Babies are seen on ultrasounds yawning. Yawning is an innate behavior. So that means that our bodies were programmed before we even came out of our mothers to yawn. And scientifically speaking, we don't know much on why we yawn, on why we sigh, but we know it probably plays a role in community. Prairie dogs yawning, alerting, waking each other up. It's something that if you talk about it even, you might notice yourself starting to yawn. It's something ingrained in our brains so deeply that we just do it. When we see other people doing it, when we talk about it, when we think about it, it's a form of communication that we don't know much on. Often people do yawn before physical exertion to help wake themselves up. They'll yawn if they're in a stressful situation. These are all things to kind of take note of because that's our body telling us that we need extra breath, we need extra life to get up before something stressful, before something physically stressful. So by controlling our breath and learning to control it on our own, we control our bodies. So before I really get into the anatomy of it, I just want to talk a minute about what oxygen is and how oxygen plays a role in our bodies, in our system, okay? When we breathe in through our mouth or our nose, air is going to go down deep into the lungs, into these little sacs called alveoli, and that is where the actual gas exchange occurs. So the red blood cells are brought by the circulatory system to our lungs, and on top of our red blood cells, we have little hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is actually what the oxygen, or CO2, sticks to. There's 4 little spots on our hemoglobin that has points for exchange. When our red blood cell comes back into our lungs and it has these little carbon dioxide molecules, they let go and oxygen replace it. So the CO2 is actually our cellular's waste. The lungs are a cleansing mechanism, and I haven't really ever considered them that way, but that's going to be something that correlates back more into the yogic talk that I don't really understand, but I'm trying. From there, we have multiple organs and organ structures involved in our respiratory system. We have our upper respiratory system and our lower respiratory system. In our upper respiratory system, we have our nasal cavity, we have our pharynx and our larynx. So the pharynx is more of the back of the throat, and the larynx, you could argue, is a part of both the upper and lower because that's the point where it separates, and that's actually our voice box. The lower respiratory system has our trachea, bronchi, our bronchioles, and inside there are alveoli. Those are all in our lungs. So we've got a left lobe and a right lobe. Outside of our respiratory tract, we have our circulatory system, which is our heart and all of our vessels, and we also have our nervous system and our brain. So it's obviously everything is so connected, and so it's hard to talk about just the respiratory system or just the nervous system or just the circulatory system because they all are one. And that's important to note because that is also a big yogic philosophy, is that we are all one. And I also still don't really get it, but I'm trying, and I'm learning. Outside of the organs, we have arguably the most important part of breathing besides obviously the lungs, and that's our diaphragm. Okay, so the diaphragm is this huge giant muscle that is attached to our lungs and attached to our ribs, and it separates our abdominal cavity from our lungs. The diaphragm is what actually expands and contracts to push the lungs in and out so we can breathe. So the lungs are encased in something called a pleura. And the pleura is a membrane, and the membrane is actually what adheres our lungs to our diaphragm. The pleura has fluid in between it, so the lungs don't stick, but they glide. And think of the fluid holding the two membranes together like water in between two pieces of glass. So you can move those pieces of glass back and forth, but you can't just directly pull them apart, right? So when the diaphragm is engaged is when you breathe in. And as it relaxes, it pushes all of our air out for us. Other muscles that are super important besides our huge diaphragm are going to be our little intercostal muscles, and those actually weave in between our ribs, which is our protective casing for our lungs. And they stick to that membrane too to help aid in our respiration, our breathing. And of course, the abdominal muscles play a role in it as well. They help mainly when you're breathing really fast, push the air out. Right? So from there, this is kind of when it starts getting a little hairy. We are going to start going into our nervous system. So the part of the nervous system that is mainly responsible for our breathing is our autonomic nervous system. We have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And those are controlled by this huge nerve, which is the longest and biggest nerve in our body, called the vagus nerve. Okay, so that runs along and is connected to our entire respiratory tract. So the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for telling our muscles to expand and contract to breathe. This is the system for rest and digest. It's the system that is responsible for your body detecting our CO2 levels, our blood's pH, to tell us if we need more oxygen, if we need less oxygen. It's always monitoring to make sure that we are at an appropriate pH level, which is determined by our CO2 and oxygen, which makes sense, right? And then we have our sympathetic nervous system, which is known as our fight or flight. When it's activated, releases a hormone or chemical called norepinephrine that is going to widen our bronchial tubes and narrow our blood vessels. So there's a lot going on. Basically, our vagus nerve is responsible for either our rest and digest or our fight or flight. And that is connected to our entire respiratory system, which makes sense now. And it's stimulated through different ways of breathing. You can either relax or increase your breathing and stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so during this research and looking into everything, I stumbled across something called the vagus nerve stimulator therapy that was started in 1997. And I'll link this information below. But basically, it's a stimulator that was implanted into people's chests, and it stimulated this vagus nerve to help control seizures for people with epilepsy, and it was then used to treat people with clinical depression. So another important thing that we need to take note with our respiratory system is that it has a relationship with our pelvic floor. So men and women have a pelvic floor, so men are not exempt from this, okay? But the pelvic floor is the muscle that holds all of our guts and stomach and everything in. And a good way to think about this relationship between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor is if you think of as a balloon. So any kind of improper breathing or holding the abdominals in while we breathe, it's going to squeeze our balloon. And it's going to squeeze our pelvic floor down and squeeze our diaphragm up. So it's really important to take note of how to breathe and proper ways to breathe just in general for normal life, because there are some really serious consequences we can suffer if we neglect any kind of breath imbalance, muscle imbalance with breathing, because it can lead to painful sex, incontinence, improper urination urges, constipation, and it can also fuck with your hips and low back, which makes sense because everything is involved. You have your abdominals, but you also have muscles in your back that are a part of your core. Core being a solid structure. And if you're breathing into one part of the balloon, it's going to eventually stretch and weaken that part of the balloon. In relation to real life, knowing the proper way to breathe is a valuable lesson that all of us can take away. Okay, so getting into a little bit more of the yogic talk. And the only reason I'm really getting into it is because if you do ever decide that you want to pursue breath work, you're going to hear these terms from instructors who are teaching you, and to me, I had no fucking clue, and it was very confusing, and this is just to help you understand. By no means does this mean this is law and this makes sense to you. This is how I am making sense of it. So if it doesn't make sense, just skip ahead, it's fine. In Hinduism and Skivism, they have these three things called the gunas. And these three gunas are the quality of everything. So the way I thought about it and think about it is they're more like a yin and a yang, okay? But there's three of them. So it's everything, good, evil, bad, the attributes, the property of everything. That's how they view it. We have our sattva, which is the state you're trying to achieve, all things good. The way I look at it is your system is working great, there's no interruptions, it's your body functioning at peak physical performance, okay? Then you have your rajas, which is the active form, building the heat, building the tapas, getting everything moving, practicing, everything that is in motion to get us to the sattva. And then we have our tamas. And the tamas is everything bad. It's cold, it's sticky, it's glue. So the way I think about the tamas is like when we're waking up in the morning and your lungs are full of mucus and you have to hack like a cat. Or maybe that's just me. I hack like a cat in the morning, so it's quite elegant, I will say. And when you're hacking like a cat in the mornings, you are in the Raja state, trying to get the mucus out to get to the Sattva state, okay? So that's how I correlate it. It's fine. Okay, so all of that being said, who uses breathwork and who can benefit from breathwork? And I actually looked into it, and divers, high altitude climbers, Navy SEALs, all of these people actually use different forms of breathwork to achieve different results. If you are going to be climbing in the Andes Mountains, you can't go from elevation that you normally live at to just the top of the Andes. You have to train your lungs to handle it. Same with divers. They have to train their lungs to handle the deep pressure and to hold their breath. Free divers who don't use oxygen, they have to train their lungs to hold their breath for 5 minutes at a time. There's all sorts of different ways to breathe. And in real life, not in yoga life, people actually use this as a tool to calm themselves. There's this thing called combat tactical breathing, where military, where cops, first responders, where healthcare workers are trained to use their breath to calm them down in stressful situations. There's also this thing called hypoventilation training. So this hypoventilation training is actually aimed to train your body to not produce the lactic acid. So basically what's happening is you're decreasing your oxygen and increasing your CO2, and you're training your body to be okay with it, to put it in acidosis and keep putting it in acidosis. And eventually your body will slowly delay the acidosis, the response, and you won't have the lactic acid, you won't have the fatigue in the muscles, in the respiratory system quite as quickly, because you're going to get it used to it gradually by training it. That all being said, I think everybody should be trying breathwork, and I'm not saying everyone should do it, okay? I mean, like, if you have anxiety, what do you have to lose? People use it. You're not going to be weird. You won't be the first person. And if you have things like asthma, obviously talk to your provider. Okay, there's telehealth, there's ways of communicating with your general provider. So my lights are going out. Thank you for watching. Please, please, please let me know if you have any thoughts, if you have any comments, if I didn't get something right. I would love to know if I'm not. Yeah, there should be more videos of uploaded classes coming soon. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day or whatever, evening. Bye.